Look, we might get started. A few little formalities just as we begin. Good afternoon, everybody. Some of you may know me. My name is Jane Paramore. I'm a Sustainability Partnership Manager here at APCO and a sometimes presenter of community webinars. So it's my pleasure to be here joining you all today and leading this discussion around a new resource and the concept of life cycle assessment in terms of packaging sustainability. An interesting discussion and probably another extension a little bit from the traditional APCO subject matter into an area that is increasingly becoming relevant in packaging sustainability. So we're glad to have you all here today. You can see a few tips there on the screen at the moment just in terms of using Zoom. For those of you who haven't joined us before, ask you to keep microphones and things on mute, and if you're talking to us, we'd like you to pop your notes into the chat box and let us know your thoughts about the conversation today, and we'll also be having a Q&A at the end of the session, and there's a Q&A function available to you, so any questions that you'd like to ask panelists as we go along towards the end of the session, please put them into the Q&A box and we'll endeavour to cover off as many of those as we can during the session. I'd also just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I reside and am working from today. I live on the land of Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd just like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and future, and welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders that we may have joining us today. Thank you very much for being with us. So to get us underway, I shall just move our slides forward and bring up the question that is the burning question of today's session. What is the role of life cycle assessment when considering packaging sustainability? So that, I guess, underpins our conversation today. In terms of how we got here, for those of you who are familiar with the work that APCO's been doing over the last couple of years, this was an area that came out in our very early investigations around looking at the packaging landscape in Australia in 2018 after the announcement of the national packaging targets, and we looked at some of the areas that were perhaps a little more esoteric to the traditional APCO subject matter, and we were getting a lot of questions from our members around life cycle assessment and what that intersection was with the APCO tools and how they would incorporate that into the implementation of packaging sustainability strategies. So last year we identified a need for a resource, and over the course of the year we worked with Edge Environment, who supported us in the development of a report that underpins this resource. And we were also very fortunate to have the involvement of our three major retailers, Aldi, Coles and Woolworths, who shared some of their packaging challenges with us and helped us to create a great set of standalone case studies that have been incorporated into this resource and will be available for members to draw on that experience and the findings of those case studies. So we're very pleased to have that information and that support in developing this resource. So in terms of the resource itself, we have developed this as a member-only resource, so it's available to our members exclusively, and when you log on to access it, you will need a password, a username and password to get to that document behind the membership firewall. It really starts as an introductory resource to bring the idea of LCA into a packaging context, to look at some of the benefits and challenges that are posed by the use of LCA, particularly in a locally nuanced context, and it's designed to give members an understanding of how to base decisions around this and other tools that form, I guess, a toolkit for the packaging sustainability strategy approach. So there are a few things particularly that I'll just call out now in terms of the way we have approached this. There is good alignment in terms of the key focus areas that APCO work with, which you can see there on the right-hand side of your screen at the moment. Of course, LCA, in terms of a packaging sustainability strategy and development process, there are a number of stages along that decision cycle that very much align with the work that we as APCO are doing in terms of things like design, engaging with customers along the supply chain to look at design issues, looking at communication and the support for things like environmental claims and certification applications, and also just that process of being able to compare materials and understand what the implications are for materials in different contexts and different applications. So we feel we have captured, I think, a very good coalescence of how LCA sits within the APCO framework. And we have a couple of speakers with us today who are going to give you a bit more of an insight into exactly what LCA is all about, how it fits into the sustainability landscape, and take us into a little bit more detail about how we can apply that in a packaging context and bring that into the packaging sustainability world. So first of all, I'm pleased to invite our first speaker, who is Tim Grant. Now, Tim's an active member of the APCO family. He is the founder of Lifecycycles, a company which is very much invested in life cycle assessment and packaging and sustainability across broad product ranges. He's given us enormous amounts of time in terms of working on this project to get this resource right for our members. And he's a specialist in life cycle assessment with over 20 years of experience in applying the methodology across a wide range of companies and organisations. Tim's a founding member and is currently the director of the Australian Life Cycle Assessment Society. And he's also written a couple of books, one, Life Cycle Assessment Principles, Practice and Prospects, which was published by the CSIRO. And he's a co-author of Design Plus Environment, a global guide to designing greener goods. Tim works across many different sectors in LCA, including packaging, but also areas like agriculture, energy, fuels, water, products, buildings, waste management. He's got a hugely diverse experience base that he brings to this conversation today. And he's worked on a lot of the development of a lot of LCA databases that are used in life cycle assessment here in Australia in recent years. So I'm pleased to hand over to Tim and invite him to come and talk a little bit more about life cycle assessment as a methodology and a tool in the sustainability toolkit.
Great, thanks, Jane. Welcome everyone, and thanks for attending. Hopefully I can, yep, there we go, we're moving. So it's always a challenge to talk about your favourite topic in a short period of time. So I'm not going to cover too much about how LCA is done. That you can go and research that, but we'll cover some of the aspects that are most important, what LCA brings to the packaging sector and to packaging decision making, and maybe some of the different ways in which that happens, and hopefully that is related to very much the guidance that's been developed. Start with why we need to do LCA. What's wrong with the existing set of design options, decision making, cost benefit analysis that we use. If we are interested in the environmental impacts of packaging, there really is no other option, because the alternative really is to base things on our intuition, and our intuition is wholly unreliable when it comes to complex systems, and more often than not we do get many things wrong when it comes to our intuitive understanding of complex systems. Back in the day, Aristotle thought eels grew from earthworms. Other people thought they just appeared in mud because they couldn't find the sexual organs. And so I wonder what, in your thinking through, you know, our decisions around things, what are the sort of eels that we have today that we think, things that we think sort of should be good because we just intuitively know it. And so that tends not to be good enough. So we need some approach to try and evaluate numerically, scientifically, the benefits of different systems. And if we're going to do that, we'll of course do that over the entire life cycle. You're not going to do it on just the production or just the material input or just the end of life. You need to evaluate it across the entire life cycle which is impacted. Packaging, at first glance, appears to be very simple. There are, compared to, you know, doing LCAs of iPhones or buildings or growing bananas, packaging has very few materials involved. The materials, many of them are common commodities sold and managed at huge scale, so they're very well understood. So at first instance, it looks relatively simple, but it's complicated by a group of things that, first of these being that packaging in itself is not an end in itself. It is a means to an end in terms of delivering products from the point of production usually through to the point of consumption. And during that process, the packaging will interact with the product. It will affect the way in which it's transported. It will affect the way in which it gets stored. Does it need to be refrigerated? It has an influence on whether products are damaged and also on whether the shelf life of products is affected. So firstly, assessing packaging in the absence of really looking at the product side of things is a real risk that you throw the baby out with the bathwater, or you have the tail wagging the dog, or whichever your favourite expression is. The second thing that really complicates packaging is the use of recycled content from the same or similar materials. And then the related to that really is what happens to the materials at end of life. And there is a complicated series of options. Things may be landfilled, they may be recycled via multiple different paths, either back into the original product or into a downcycled product or potentially into an upcycled product. There may be composting, and they will have different performances depending on where you are, if it's commercial or not. There is landfill, and landfill has mixed practices. If you're in South Australia, you're not, half your landfills aren't capturing gas. If you're in New South Wales, your landfills are doing some pre-degradation, which affects the methane. If you're in Victoria, you have fairly high rates of gas capture. So these things really do vary the results of studies over time. And then you've got litter and the relationships with litter over different locations and different behaviours. So we end up with a bunch of tensions that sit between different packaging materials and packaging formats. We have multi-layer flexible versus simpler heavy layer materials. We have renewables versus synthetic. We have degradables versus reusable. We have products being packaged or not packaged as an option. And in a way, many of these things really, a bit like rock, paper, scissors, none of them score on all points, and they tend to score against one another under different situations. So trying to resolve those tensions is something which LCA has a real role in. How LCA resolves those tensions is we put all of those things, the landfill amount, the recycling, the recycled content, the renewability, they all go into sort of captured in what's referred to in LCA as the technosphere. It's like the economy. It's a model of what happens. And so we ignore, in a way, that something is recycled content and just look at what recycled content brings to the impact of the product. Does it lower the impact a lot, or does it lower it just a small amount? What does end of life recycling bring? And so we put all those things together so that we can then independent of those terms, evaluate the net amount of damage that occurs to the environment because of a packaging system. And that would include interactions with product, with transport, or across the life cycle. So we analyse things from cradle to grave, from raw material extraction right through the life cycle. When we do that, we then, what's of interest to us in environmental assessment is what are the resources that are taken in, the stocks and flows which are taken from the planet to produce a given level of output from the economy or the technosphere, and what are the emissions back to the environment that occur as a function of that activity. We take that very long list, which is hideous and difficult to understand, and we link it to the things that we ultimately care about. And so in following the mixer analogy, the cake, what we're interested in is the benefits to society in terms of human health, in terms of the health of ecosystems, and the longevity of our resources. And so we try and find links between the emissions and everything that occur because of the materials used, the recycling that happens, the degradation that occurs in landfills or composts or alike, and we link those through different indicator pathways across different impacts to ultimately to what is the environmental damage that occurs. And so that by that way, LCA can really help resolve some of those tensions. Now, I think it's important because there's a when we say, the title of this is life cycle assessment, and so we have such a very strong focus, and correctly a very strong focus on climate change impacts as a national and global targets and the Paris agreements, and but LCA reaches beyond that and tries to take a look at a range of environmental indicators. And in fact, the list of indicators seems to be getting longer all the time. But I think it's important maybe to examine what impacts are in and out, what should be assessed. And it's nice to be able to congratulate ourselves about some things that we've done successfully in terms of reducing environmental impact. So I've grouped the impacts into things where we're winning, things where we still have some challenges, and some new impact categories that are coming of interest. So where we're winning, I would say we're definitely winning in ozone layer depletion, and the ozone layer is on track to be repaired by 2050. There are some issues with illegal use of some substances. Nitrous oxide has a small effect, but by and large, we've succeeded in dealing with a global issue in that way. Things like photochemical ozone formation, so that's your summer smog, vehicle improvements and things, the level of exceedances of summer smog are very low, particularly in developed countries these days. Acid rain, the removal of acid gases from power generation and combustion processes and the use of low sulfur fuels has significantly reduced that. Still a bit of an issue in China, a couple of geographies, but mostly solved. I think the quiet one, unless you're actually in the farm sector, soil erosion and salinity. The introductions of no-till, no-till farming and irrigation management. When I went through my environmental degree in 1990s, erosion and salinisation were like really big topics, and now they're not totally solved, but they are significantly reduced with revolutions really in farm management. And in terms of toxicity from emissions, the number of instances, our understanding of key emissions that cause ill health has improved a lot, and you would have to say that is better now than what it was maybe 30 years ago. So, well done us. We can deal with things when we tackle them in a systematic way and use good science. The things where we still have some challenges, climate change, by far the biggest issue of our time. I don't really need to talk much about that. Nutrient enrichment, I was hoping to put this on the winning list, but I think with reductions in water flows and conflict with water, and I looked at the state of environment, I think we still have significant algal blooms and challenges in terms of nutrient enrichment of waterways and land. So I think eutrophication, as it's called, is still a significant challenge. Ecotoxicity, probably still an issue, and water scarcity. I have here in the existing challenges, we knew it was a problem, but probably is with the influences of climate change will increase in its importance over time. And then we get the new areas of concern. Particulate matter, we all found out about that over the summer before we were hit with COVID. So we had very significant health issues. No one could go out and exercise. That sort of problem exists all the time across the world in different instances, and probably is the biggest single, before COVID, was one of the biggest single environmental killers of people. Land competition, we live on one planet. The competition between land use is fierce, and now we've got to use some land to try and grow carbon. We're using land to grow natural fibres and biofuel. So land competition is increasing because our land area is not. Indoor workplace exposures is coming into the LCA frame. We haven't normally included it. There's a lot of push to include that. Diet is a really interesting one that people would like to bring into LCA. We do LCAs of beef versus meat-free burgers. Look at the environmental impacts, but in fact, the diet impacts of these things are often much more important to human health outcomes than the upstream environmental consequences. Litter and microplastics are of key concern to people, and social impacts, I think, will be in the what we know is that many of the health concerns that we look at from environmental causes are much larger from social impact causes such as underpayment of wages and things of that ilk. And so there's a real desire, if we're going to have a comprehensive thing that looks at the health of the globe, that those things are brought in. But they're sort of more in the cutting edge. To understand why they're in the cutting edge, if we look at this, is the total causes, all-cause mortality for different risks and diseases. And we can see the first three are very much behavioural related: diet, blood pressure. But you see particulate matter is the fourth highest. Indoor air pollution, mostly from particulate matter, is the fourth highest cause of DALYs, disability adjusted life years, mortality and morbidity. And then ambient particulate matter pollution is number 8 or 9 in terms of total loss of life through health concerns related to that. So we're very interested in the things that hit big ticket items in there. You'll also see dietary risks, obviously number 1, hence the wish to bring that into an LCA frame, and occupational risks are also very high in the mortality statistics. So that's just to say, when we're looking at these LCA impact categories, we're very much focusing on what actually happens and where the damage comes from. That brings us to the issue of that is very close to packaging, which is this issue of marine litter and microplastics. We don't see that on the graph of health consequences. We have lots of data about litter counts and litter quantities and units per square metre and tonnes in the ocean and the relativity of plastic in the ocean compared to fish. What we don't have is data on what the actual effects of macro litter and microplastics are. We have a lot of images of seahorses with their tail around cotton buds, but the actual data on the number of species and whether this is really a large, compared to something like climate change, is this a significant threat, or is it more of a visual annoyance, is something we really need to get a handle on. We do have a litter, European Union have a litter impact method that was developed and published a few years ago, based on a 2005 study from RMIT that I was involved in. So I'm very pleased that they took this up. And it uses a persistence times a fauna impact ratio. So it looks at, for different materials, how persistent they would be in the marine environment or in a terrestrial environment. And then when they, while they are there, what sort of damage they would cause fauna and in those two environments, and they're multiplied together to give a really simple indicator. So we can measure litter impacts in a relative way. That is once something is littered. The other really big challenge here is how you actually determine how much is littered, because it's very hard to relate if we produce 1 million bottles of water, what percentage of those bottles actually end up in the litter stream in a given geography. So mostly in Australia, litter is like an accidental occurrence. So it's not like measuring the CO2 from something. It is something no one sort of reports that they littered this amount, because it's normally an accidental activity. And I was in a presentation this morning with our LCA Society, and we looked at some data where companies are tracking their total plastic emission to the world over their supply chain. And of course, a lot of it comes up in particular countries where there isn't an established waste management system, and that's where the large volumes of litter are occurring. And yet we're trying to manage litter in a developed economy where the leaks are much less. Which really brought me to the idea that litter is much more akin to sewage than CO2, in a way that before we had sanitation, we had sewage running open in the streets, and it caused a lot of health problems, and we sort of put up with it, and we knew it was bad. And then it got to a point where we said no more, and we put in a system. The system sometimes still leaks. Some places don't have good systems, and even the systems that, when they work, still have a small amount of impact. And this is a little bit akin to the way I think maybe if we were to view litter as in this management frame, that might be more useful than maybe looking at it as a traditional emission. So one last thing on the sort of indicators. One way of trying to resolve all of those the recycled content, the reuse, the recycling and end of life, the efficiency, is something like the material circularity indicator. So you can download this tool from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation from their website, and it's an interesting number to be able to play around, and it really gives you an idea of how much you're contributing at each end of the recycling system. You use some recycled content, you recycle end of life, and it basically resolves those two things. So it can be a useful view, including recycling efficiency and the like. Okay, how is LCA done? So there's a 4-step process for doing LCA. You start by asking a question, and it's really good if you've got a good comparison. You say, I want to use this product or that product, or I'm going to have big packages or small packages. Determine who the audience is, and that can really decide if you want to go to the public and make a big claim. You're going to need a big LCA to do that. If you're internally trying to make some decisions, then the level of analysis and review is much less than if it's public. The guts of the LCA is done where you go and collect data on, okay, what is your product? What does it weigh? What are the materials? You then go and look generally for some background data about how materials are made and what the life cycle history is of each material, also of the waste treatment processes and manufacturing processes. And I'll put in a plug here for, in Australia, we have a thing called Agile LCA, which is a national life cycle inventory database developed by the LCA Society, LCAS, over the last 15 years, and it was reviewed by the UN against a bunch of other international databases and scored very, very well. So we link to those background databases, and we sum across the whole lot and get a big long list of flows that we can't really interpret until we link through to the indicators, and there we'll come out with a group of indicators that are relevant to the product and compare them. So you don't need to include every indicator. The idea there is to include indicators that really mean something to you and mean something to the product system. The final step is interpretation, and this is where you really investigate. You say, okay, I've got an answer. I really need to understand why the answer is like it is. Is it because of local conditions? And you really test the robustness so that if you're going to make a decision, then you know that, yes, this decision works as long as we're in Victoria and their recycling rate is at roughly 50%, then the answer plays out. But if we send it to Europe and it's all combusted, we maybe get a different answer. LCA comes in different sizes, and so there are different tools that you would use at different sorts. So for big investment decisions, you need big LCA. So if the government is going to ban plastic bags, they would commission a very substantial study. If you're trying to make an internal choice about, choosing between 2 or 3 packaging materials for one of your packaging products, that's a much smaller choice, and you can use a much smaller LCA tool. In the big end of town, these are for sort of strategic decisions. They can be both internal to companies, but also if you're looking at policy making or public claims of superiority. If you're doing this sort of thing, you normally would use an LCA specialist. There is a list of LCA specialists there from our LCA Society, which you can go to, and you'd use very detailed LCA tools, the SEMAPro, Gabi, OpenLCA. These are like, they're sort of like GIS. They're as complicated as maybe GIS or that sort of software. They're not like Microsoft Word or Excel where anyone can just pick them up and run them. So that's at the sort of the bigger end of LCA. An example of this where we're working currently in with a group at Monash. I saw some Monash people are online called Varden, who are using sugarcane to make coffee capsules, amongst other things. And they've been using a light form of big LCA, but nevertheless using LCA software and using that to actually help refine their manufacturing processes and understand where their hotspots are, and actually made some changes to their technology. And then eventually they will use that in a marketing sense to market to potential clients of a product like that. At the agile end, I won't call it the small end of LCA, but in the agile end, we have eco-design, lifecycle management, some internal decision-making. Here, you would use some of the simpler tools. You may be done by a packaging specialist or a technical specialist within the company. And here you've got simplified tools. There's things like PK, EcoDex, Compass, and I think Garby also have a packaging tool. So these are simplified tools. You don't get to see into the full background database. They are structured around the packaging industry, so they can be used in a more ongoing sense. Examples of that, Jolique use an LCA tool on all new packaging options, regardless of how it's changed. It's one of the gates they go through in their design thing. Global companies like Nestle, Unilever have customized tools that they've built specifically for their own requirements to look at packaging and product assessment. So these are really internalising the LCA assessment process. Are there some shortcuts? Probably the best shortcut is prior LCA studies. A review, many good decisions can be made with quick assessment of the literature that's out there can tell you a lot. Probably 80-20 rule, you can find out a lot about the system that you can find that by looking at studies that have already been done. It's hard to pull out a golden rule, like those series of tensions that I listed at the start. You can't give a single answer for any one of those tensions because it really will depend on so many factors that go in there. What you do find, we find here with companies that use eco-design tools internally, after a little while, they get to be able to predict what the tool will say because you get surprised the first time and the second time you've forgotten, maybe you're surprised again. But eventually, your design team get oriented to the scientific signals that come out of the software. And then just to note, there's management practices, things over time, that's great, you will get to know, but things do move over time, thankfully. Electricity grids change, waste treatment gets better, new materials come online, and this does change the results of individual circumstances. And so finally, because I think I'm well up to time, so prioritise things which matter. Don't get swamped by, if you go into LCA, don't get swamped by all the numbers. A lot of people just use climate change and you could do worse. That's a fantastic effort to bring that into decision making. But then maybe look at some red flags, some other indicators. Did you have a water hotspot or land use hotspot, something else of that like? So will depend a little bit on the product. Okay, that's me.
Tim, thank you very much. I think that was a great overview of how this methodology approach fits in to the world that we're operating in. There's a few interesting things there that I pulled out of that. I think one of the things that you really articulated beautifully was the flexibility of it really as a methodology, that it has application if you're just a small business starting out, but it also has application if you're big institutional organizations trying to do that sort of systemic change across economies. So it really does have very good application. I think what I might do is move on to our next speaker, who everybody is probably quite familiar with, Dr. Helen Lewis, who works very closely with APCO and is another member of the family. Helen's going to bring that context of utilising that methodology down into the packaging context in a little more detail. Now, Helen has been also an integral part of developing this resource for us that we're launching today. She works very closely with APCO on a number of areas around product stewardship and packaging sustainability, and again is a very knowledgeable person in this space, so we're very pleased to have her alongside us working on this stuff. Helen runs her own consulting business, and she provides research and strategic advice right across industry and government, particularly on product stewardship and packaging. She's also an adjunct professor at the Institute for Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology, Sydney. and she's a consultant to APCO, of course, so a very active member of our family. She's also written very widely on this topic around product stewardship and corporate social responsibility. She wrote a fantastic book around product stewardship in action, and her Packaging for Sustainability is one of my go-to reference books when I need some information in this space, so certainly a very informed voice on the topic. So Helen, I'm going to pass over to you.
Thank you, Jane, and hello everybody. It's great to be here this afternoon. This is something that I'm certainly very interested in. I should say I'm not an LCA expert. That's why I rely on people like Tim and Edge and ThinkStep and all the other experts in this field. My interest in LCA really is in terms of how it's used. I've been involved in quite a lot of research projects where we've brought LCA in to try to answer particular questions. And my role has usually been in the interface between the scientist, like a Tim, and the end user, and trying to make sense of quite complex information. Just something from left field, I just thought I'd start with my favourite Canbrook kettle, because when I was working for RMIT back in the 1990s, we were helping big brands, including Canbrook and Blackmores and others, to look at how they could integrate environment into their products. At that time, it was radical and new. Now it's fairly mainstream, thank goodness. But this was an example. I think this was the first one where we commissioned an LCA. LCA just wasn't being used in Australia. It was much more widely used in Europe and the US. We did an LCA that highlighted that the biggest impact of the kettle was in use because of the electricity use. We did some consumer surveys and did the LCA, and that shaped the whole design approach. We then decided to focus very much on energy use, and that we ended up with a design that had a double wall to insulate the water, because we realised people were pressing the kettle on button too many times and wasting electricity. So that was really a revelation, and after that we brought Tim in and he set up the whole LCA program, and the rest is history. So I guess my interest is in how LCA can answer certain questions, and here are a few of the ones that Tim's already really touched on. You know, where are my biggest impacts? How do I prioritise? What materials should I use? That's an oldie but a goodie. Everyone wants to know that. Unfortunately, there's never a simple answer. And is reusable packaging better for the environment? So they're just a few of the questions that I thought I'd just provide some examples. Just keep in mind that I'm only providing a snapshot, and context and detail is everything. So it's more to illustrate how they can throw up interesting insights, I guess. Okay, so this one is for Bulla Ice Cream. So hello to the people from Bulla who are online, I believe, from Bulla Dairy. So one of the questions people sometimes ask is, yeah, where are the impacts in my business or my supply chain? How do I prioritise? And this one was from a project that was done by AIG and Sustainability Victoria back in 2011, where they looked at supply chains working together on an LCA to find opportunities. So this one is the value chain for ice cream, for Bulla Ice Cream. And the interesting thing for this one was that it showed up that dairy farming was the biggest impact, so the on-farm impacts, methane emissions from cows, for example, nitrous oxides. That was a big one. Retail freezers, around 36%, you see on the left there. Bulla manufacturing, down the bottom there at 9%. And the packaging, the tub and lid, around 5%, which is not to say the packaging's not important, of course, because that's got its own impacts. But in this case, the question was around the value chain and how can we work together to look at impacts. And that really focused the attention of the brands on on-farm impacts. Similarly, this sort of data can be used for carbon reporting or environmental product declarations and so on, as Jane set out at the beginning in terms of certification or communication. The second example is from our friends at Edge Environment and KeepCup, and I like this one for a couple of reasons, because it tried to address a few different questions. So Edge was commissioned to compare 3 KeepCup designs with a couple of single-use options, compostable and paperboard, as well as a few different designs for the KeepCup. And this one was looking at carbon emissions, and you can see that the reusable cups had the lowest impact per use when you think of how many times a KeepCup is used. But the other question was, how can KeepCup look at their impacts, and how can they reduce their impacts? And in this case, you'll see this is CO2 emissions on the axis there, and the supply chain phases on the x-axis there. So cup manufacturing, assembly and delivery are on the left. Their impacts are relatively small when you compare them to the impacts in use. And this is because the cups have to be washed. And that's something we sometimes forget when we look at the benefits of reuse. And that's not to say that's a disaster. What that says is companies like KeepCup and cafes and so on have to educate customers about energy and water efficiency, for example, and how do you manage those sort of impacts. So the other question about what materials should I use, I picked one for one of our favourite topics, which is shopping bags. And this was from an LCA that Tim and our colleague Carly Verghese did back in 2005. It was part of a bigger study that we did for a couple of clients, where we compared different biodegradable bags with other single-use bags and reusable bags. And the whole question about material, I should preface that by saying those sort of questions about which material should I use are complex, because it depends on the actual product and how it's designed, and also how it's used by the consumer, which is really critical. So for things like KeepCups and reusable bags, obviously the consumer behaviour is critical. And it also depends on which metric or which indicator you use, and Tim talked a little bit about that. But just to show you how this sort of a study threw up insights that weren't necessarily intuitive. Tim said that our intuition is not always right. So in this case, Tim and Carly compared a number of different biodegradable bags that are on the left-hand side there. The single-use HDPE bag and the single-use paper bag, which are in the middle there, and 4 different types of reusable bag on the right-hand side there. And I guess if you look at what this is telling us, I guess paper, which we love because it's renewable and it's recyclable, but it does have significant carbon impacts. The reusable bags, we assumed that people use them about once a week, 52 times. I mean, in reality, I don't know about you, but mine are still going strong after a few years. But the conclusion from this study was that the reusable bags, assuming they're used many times, are better. But in terms of behaviour, if you reduce that number from 52 to 10, the result would be quite different. And at the time, every retailer was giving away reusable bags, and they were all piling up in our cupboards. So it's really being careful about the design and the behavioural aspects as well. So at that time, this was used by a retailer to decide which way they were going, and they decided to focus on reusables. Just one last study that I was going to mention that both Tim and I were involved in for a company called Disruptive Packaging. Their Unicore packaging, which is for fresh produce and other B2B packaging. They looked at the life cycle impacts of the packaging, and this is just looking at climate change. And it just shows you how this sort of information can be presented. Shows the net carbon impact is the pale blue fat bar there, and the individual impacts in the middle. It showed that the footprint was around 1.8 kilos of CO2 per 100 litres of capacity. So that was interesting, looking at where the impacts were. The net benefit of recycling is shown in the dark blue. But the other question was, how does it compare to other packaging formats? So we compared the Unicore with cardboard, polystyrene, core flute and waxed cardboard. And what was really interesting and perhaps surprising for me was the fact that Unicore did come out quite well, and that's partly because of it's manufactured from calcium carbonate or limestone and HDPE, which contributed to its low carbon footprint. And so, yeah, that was a really interesting process to go through, and the company's been using this to communicate the benefits to potential customers. But embedded in this LCA are certain recycling rates, which are critical to the performance as well. So there's a whole lot of lessons that you can learn from an LCA. Okay, that was it. I just wanted to, before I finish, just quickly comment on how how LCA links into a couple of APCO's tools. The SPG that all of the APCO members know about, the Packaging Sustainability Framework and Reporting. The SPGs are based on a life cycle approach, so it's not just about recyclability. They ask our members to think about things like efficiency, product waste, recycled materials, renewability, litter, and so on, and help members to look at trade-offs. And LCA can obviously help with some of those. Members also have to report against the Packaging Sustainability Framework, which is shown on this screen. And LCA is relevant to quite a few of them. For example, the Packaging Sustainability Strategy 1.1, LCA can be used to identify priorities and strategies that can then be embedded into business practice through a sustainability strategy. It can also be used for 2.1, which is packaging design and procurement, of course, to weigh up the pros and cons of different materials or designs. And when members are reporting, they are asked how many of their products have been reviewed against the SPG, and members do that. If a member says, I've reviewed 100% of my products against the SPG, they're then asked how many have used LCA or a similar life cycle tool. And that's not to say that LCA is mandatory. That's not at all the case. It's just saying that some companies can go to another level and start to use LCA more strategically around some of their design decisions. And members who are using LCA are recognised for it through the reporting tool and the sort of score that they get at the end of their reporting process. Over to you, Jane. I think there's quite a few questions.
Helen, yes, thank you. Let me just wrest control back from you. So we've got a few questions coming through there, Helen and Tim. Yes, absolutely. Look, there's one, I'm seeing one in the chat window and one in the Q&A box that are kind of similar. People are asking, is there any tool or site where we can refer to and look for LCA for different types of materials in general, which kind of also goes along with, if I'm a small business, where should I get started doing LCA? Is there an easy desktop tool that somebody can recommend, or somewhere that we can find resources to inform those questions?
Yeah, I think, look, there are a number of tools. The industry is well serviced with tools. So we have one here, so I don't want to preference our tool above anyone else's, but there are a number of eco-design tools. So you'll see PK, Compass, there's ThinkStep Packaging, there's EcoDex. So if you Google around those, you will find, have a look at the different ones. They generally all have demos you can go in and have a look at, and you can, so that's probably the sort of easy end. There's not one place I would say which sort of houses all the LCAs of the world. There's always been like a discussion in the LCA community, we should put together a website that has all the LCAs that have ever been done, and then it always falls apart, because as soon as you start accumulating them, they push in one direction or another, and so there is a sort of but there's plenty out there. If you Google LCA studies, you'll find of a particular thing. It's pretty quick to find examples of studies. Yeah, the eco design tools is probably the place to start, unless you have a really big heavy question that you're getting hammered from a supplier or from government and you need to tackle in a sort of public declaration sort of way. Then you might go to an LCA professional to get some work done.
Helen, did you have anything to add there?
Only that was the question of building a database of LCA studies was something we talked about last year. I think it was at APCO, and we decided that there were benefits of doing it, but there were risks of doing it, because people rely on, let's say, the old shopping bag conundrum, and we go and look at a study, well, things have moved on, as Tim said. Waste systems move on. We've now got more composting systems, waste management processes are different, and so on. So I think, it's a nice idea. I think a better idea is to just Google, you want to know about coffee capsules, Google LCA of coffee capsules, and a number of them will come up, and similar for other sectors or products.
And there's a small list of resources in the back of the guidelines that we're publishing today that kind of leads in some of those directions as well, just where you can find out about more information in that respect as well. Okay, following on question from that one, how do we communicate the benefits highlighted through LCAs to consumers? For example, many see paper is better, and I think, Helen, that example you just pulled up shows us that can be a questionable assumption in many contexts, but in LCAs, that's not always true. How do we actually communicate that to our consumers to let them understand that we're actually making educated decisions in these spaces? Is that a marketer's job, I wonder? Is this the part of getting the whole team involved at that very early process, in part of the process when you're designing your products and trying to explain, what you're doing to improve?
I think there was a question there on, where do we find out about which of the sustainable materials? And I think it's important to communicate that there are no sustainable materials, and it's really what the material does in its function that is really makes it more sustainable than another material. So, if you're, one of the things that came out of the shopping bags, man, it's really difficult to compete with a polyethylene singlet bag. The performance of those 11 grams of plastic is extraordinary. And but if you want an apparel bag where you need something stiff and a walking billboard for your brand, really difficult to do in plastic. Paper is by far the most efficient way for a really rigid thing. And so, the material properties really affect what is the most effective solution. So it's a difficult communication thing because there is a strong push towards natural, and people who are using things that are natural really like to push that. But we know that there are a lot of things that are I think the Ellen MacArthur Foundation really highlight it well, that we separate the sort of natural cycle things, and so you can either have things that are operating in a biological cycle, and that's your paper materials and organic type materials, and then when you go into something that's non-natural or technical materials, as they refer to, steel and plastic and those sort of things, then we use them and we make sure that they stay out of the waste and they just cycle over and over and over. So, one's really short cycle of materials being used and used again, maybe with energy as a final outcome. But on the other side, you can go down. They're two different pathways, and keeping those materials separate is what's important.
I might just add, Jane, I think that communication question is a really critical one, because often the results we get from an LCA aren't intuitive, or they go contrary to the mainstream view of something. And I think as brands, we really do need to balance out the need to actually generate real environmental improvement while also communicating and meeting our customer needs. So I think we do need to educate customers where something that may not be intuitively the best actually does perform a lot better. Because, there is this view that, paper's good, plastic's bad, single use is bad, reusable's good, and so on. And we have had some experiences where companies have tried really hard to communicate, like Nestle a few years ago, RMIT did an LCA of their sachet for coffee, which they were replacing some glass packaging, and they generated huge environmental benefit by switching the packaging. And they did communicate that on pack in quite a clever way. But not entirely successful, I think, as a communication process. But I think we do need to persevere, and we do need to use LCA to inform our engagement with consumers if we're going to generate real environmental, gain.
And I feel that with the sort of rise of the conscious consumer side of things, people want to be educated in this space. They want to understand what is the right thing to do. And I think that if you're, as a company, prepared to try and engage them with that story, then you bring them along the journey with you. And we end up with a more informed consumer base as well, which means that those decisions and choices are easier to make from their perspective and easier to make from our perspective in terms of implementing. Okay, just looking, I'm conscious of the time. We've got about 3 minutes left. Just leading on from that question, another one around whether or not it makes sense to do an LCA early on in the piece before you're investing time and energy and dollars into product development. Is that a good place to start your process?
The earlier the better, and don't wait until you've got all the information. So many people will say, "Oh, we're going to do the LCA. We're still working on the parameters." Do the LCA on the lightest amount of information you have, because you will get insights that really judge that next step. There's so much lock-in in a design process where you've gone down the path and you've already decided you're using a wet one, something or other, a particular type of technology or material. And then it's too late to reverse back up when you realise maybe that wasn't a good choice, or maybe you need something that uses renewable energy, or maybe there's a different type of chemical. So the idea of Agile LCA, really using it when you've got as early as you can, and we've found that with Varden out at Monash, that they've found great. They were still. Their next thing is the pipe, still at very early development stage, and they've had didn't expect. They really wanted initial bit of work to think about marketing, and then they've looked at it and gone, "Oh, really? What?" They didn't realise where the impacts were, and now they've gone back to development.
And I think that certainly goes to that diagram that you brought up, just talking about that constant reinforcement loop. You do that at every stage of the process and make sure that all the decisions you're making are informed, and also you're informed by the outcomes of what you're seeing in terms of the assessment process. So reiterative loop there always.
And that's where those streamlined LCA tools are really useful, because they can be relatively easy to use with some training. And yeah, they're really powerful. If you've got someone in the organisation who can do them in a fairly quick and easy way, then you can keep coming back and say, what if I change the format? What if the material's a bit thicker? Or maybe if I change this or that? They're really useful, particularly for where the questions are quite difficult,
Look, folks, I'm conscious of time again. We've only got a moment or so left. If we haven't answered any of your questions, please feel free to get in touch. We can certainly address some of those via the APCO mailbox, apco@packagingcovenant.org.au. In terms of the presentation today, just a couple of points I think that I'm hoping you've drawn from this afternoon's conversation. Certainly LCA is a very valuable and very robust methodology to be implementing in terms of looking at your packaging sustainability. But I think one of the things that we're all starting to understand is that it really does have its limitations, and it needs to be part of a broader suite of tools and sources of information that come together, I think, in a packaging context to really create a holistic view of what the impacts of these materials and formats that we're using really have. In terms of the resource, I mentioned that it's up there on the website. Please, I encourage members to get in there and have a little look at it. There's a lot of information in that document. It also goes to a broader discussion around plastic footprinting that we're seeing a lot of movement on as well, and the shift towards whether or not we can quantify these impacts in a slightly more universal way that takes some of those more broad information sources into account. And I read a really interesting report last year for anybody that's keen to explore it more, from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, reviewing different plastic footprinting methodologies and looking at how LCA actually aligns with some of the objectives that are being set in that space. For people who'd like to know more in this space, our friends over at the Australian Institute of Packaging have developed a fantastic training course as well, which looks at the packaging context in a little more detail and takes you into a bit more of a deep dive around some of the tools and applications that are out there and how they function. So if people are keen to look in more detail there, that's a great place to start. But I guess I would just like to thank, firstly, our two speakers today, Helen and Tim. Thank you very much for joining us and giving us some really great insight into this space. I think it's a new one for some and a slightly challenging one for others. So I hope that we've managed to capture some good advice and recommendation there as to how to go about it. I'd also like to thank all the people that were involved in developing the resource, Edge Environment, Aldi, Coles and Woolworths, and of course the internal team here at APCO, who've done a fantastic job in getting this together and getting it out to our members. We're very happy to be launching that to you today, and we look forward to hearing your feedback back on what you think and how it all looks to you. And I'd also like to thank Jo, who is hosting us from the background there and keeping us all on track. She keeps this series running all the time, and we're very grateful to have her doing all the legwork behind the scenes to get us up and running every week. So thank you all to everybody for coming today, and we hope that you will be able to join us for next week's session, which is around sustainable investment. So a whole new area of looking at sustainability from I guess, an economic perspective, and something new for us. So very exciting to be presenting that to you next week. So thank you all very much for joining us, and happy rest of the afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you at the next community webinar. Good afternoon, one and all.
Thanks, everyone.
See you later.